Every time I say your name, a lot of people, create a name when they get into show business. Vin Diesel is one of my favorites. It's such a cool name. It's a good name.
There are moments in life when even the strongest people, the ones we think are unshakable, quietly carry a kind of pain the world never sees. And for years, Vin Diesel was one of them. Behind the roaring engines, behind the iconic one-liners, behind the tough guy image that defined an entire generation of action movies, there was a wound he never learned how to talk about. Not because he didn't want to, but because he simply wasn't ready. Most people saw the fame, the success, the global franchise built on family. But almost no one realized how much he was hurting underneath it all, and how deeply one moment changed him forever. It wasn't a career setback. It wasn't a Hollywood scandal. It was something far more personal. Something that left a mark he tried to hide, even from those closest to him. And when he finally opened up about 8 years later, fans were stunned, not by the story itself, but by how long he carried this weight in silence. Today, we're diving into the truth he kept tucked away, the emotional battle he rarely speaks about, and the moment he finally said, "I wasn't ready for this." And what makes Vin Diesel's story so different from the usual Hollywood heartbreak is that he never wanted the world to feel sorry for him. He wasn't trying to turn his pain into headlines or sympathy. Instead, he buried those feelings so deep that even the people closest to him didn't always know how heavy the weight had become. What fans saw on screen was strength, leadership, and loyalty. But off-screen, he was constantly trying to hold himself together, pretending he was fine when the truth was far from it. It wasn't until years later, when the pressure, the memories, and the silence finally caught up to him, that he let himself admit what had been there all along. A piece of him had been missing, and he didn't know how to refill that empty space. The moment he finally opened up wasn't planned, rehearsed, or polished. It was raw. It was honest. And it was the first time he publicly acknowledged the pain he once thought he could outrun. And to understand why this moment mattered so much, we need to go back to the beginning, to the bond that changed his life long before he ever realized how important it truly was. Long before there were massive box office numbers, international premieres, or entire stadiums of fans chanting his name, Vin Diesel had something far more rare, a brotherhood that didn't need to be advertised. And this connection didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly, quietly, in the small moments between takes, in long conversations away from the cameras, and in the countless hours spent building a franchise neither of them knew would one day define their careers. That bond became the foundation of everything that would follow. And as this connection deepened, so did the sense of trust between them. Vin wasn't someone who opened up easily. He carried his life like a fortress, with thick walls and guarded doors. But with Paul Walker, those walls softened. They weren't competing. They weren't pretending. They were simply two men navigating fame, family, and responsibility, side by side. Their chemistry on screen came from a real place, a real friendship that didn't need to be exaggerated. Fans could feel it, even if they didn't know why. One moment in particular showed just how close they had become. When Vin was expecting his first child, it wasn't a family member or a lifelong friend who gave him the confidence to step into fatherhood. It was Paul. He was the one who told Vin to be brave, to be present, to show up for that new chapter. He even encouraged him to cut the umbilical cord, a gesture so profound that it shifted how Vin saw him forever. That wasn't co-star advice. That was family talking. And this growing closeness would later become the source of the deepest pain Vin had ever faced. Because when someone becomes that important, losing them doesn't feel like losing a friend. It feels like losing a part of yourself. And that moment was coming faster than anyone realized. That deep connection made what happened next feel almost unreal. When the news broke, Vin thought it had to be a mistake, some kind of rumor blown out of proportion. Hollywood is full of noise, full of false alarms, full of stories that appear and vanish within minutes. But this time, it wasn't noise. It wasn't exaggerated. It was real. And it hit with a force he wasn't prepared for. The shock wasn't just emotional. It was physical. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. For someone who had always been the strong one, the protector, the steady presence, he suddenly didn't know how to breathe, how to think, or how to process what he'd just heard. And what made it even harder was the silence that followed. A kind of stillness that felt wrong, heavy, unnatural, because the world had lost a star, but Vin had lost something much deeper. Despite barely holding himself together, he went straight to the Walker family home. He thought he was going there to offer comfort, to be the steady presence everyone expected him to be. But the moment he walked through the door, everything changed. Instead of supporting others, he found himself collapsing emotionally, unable to hold back the grief he thought he could contain. And then came the moment that stayed with him for years, when Paul's mother looked at him and, with tears in her eyes, said, "You lost your other half." She wasn't trying to comfort him. She wasn't trying to make the pain easier. She was acknowledging something he hadn't been able to say out loud, that the bond they shared wasn't casual. It wasn't Hollywood branding. It was real family. Those words cut deeper than anything else he'd heard that night, because they were true. And accepting that truth was the first step toward understanding just how much he would struggle to keep going in the months that followed. In the months after the tragedy, Vin carried himself the way he always had. Strong, composed, almost unbreakable. But underneath that outer shell, things were far from steady. Every interview, every media appearance, every moment on set felt like he was acting in a completely different movie than the one he was being paid to film. He wasn't playing an action hero anymore. He was trying to play himself without falling apart. And while fans saw him return to filming, smiling, promoting, working like he always did, they didn't realize how hard it was for him just to show up. The Fast and Furious franchise had always been built around family, loyalty, brotherhood, words that now carried a weight he wasn't ready to face. Every line, every scene, every callback to the theme of family reminded him of what he had lost. It didn't feel like acting. It felt like reopening a wound. One day on set, during a scene that was meant to be lighthearted, Vin felt something crack. There wasn't a warning, no gradual buildup, just a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion that hit him like a freight train. He had to step away, walk off set, and take a moment just to breathe. He later admitted he wasn't proud of that moment, because he had always seen himself as the strong one. But grief doesn't care about pride, and heartbreak doesn't care about reputation. And what made it even harder was the pressure to keep going, to deliver, to lead. The entire world was watching. The studio was waiting. The cast was looking to him to set the tone. And through all of that, he was expected to hold it together. Yet in those quiet moments between takes, when the cameras stopped rolling and no one was watching, he knew he was still falling apart. And even though he didn't say it out loud, a part of him wondered how he was supposed to move forward when the person who had given him so much strength was no longer there. But moving forward wasn't something he could avoid. And eventually, he found something unexpected that helped him keep going. As the years went on, the pain didn't disappear. It simply changed shape. What began as shock slowly turned into a quiet ache that followed Vin everywhere. But with time, something else began to grow alongside that grief: purpose. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't something he planned. It came from a part of his life that Paul had influenced more deeply than anyone realized: fatherhood. Long before the tragedy, Paul had been the one encouraging Vin to embrace being a dad. He had spoken about it with such passion, such joy, that it left a lasting mark. And after the loss, those words took on a different meaning. They became a guide, a reminder of what still mattered. A reminder that life, even when it hurts, must continue. Every milestone with his children became a way of honoring that friendship. Every birthday, every school event, every moment of growth reminded him of the man who once told him to be there, fully, for the family he was building. And that encouragement became one of the few things that helped him piece himself back together. But healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean replacing the pain with something else. Instead, it meant accepting that loss had become part of who he was. Some days he managed it gracefully. Other days, the memories hit without warning. But with each passing year, he became more comfortable acknowledging the truth that he would never fully stop missing his friend. And that acceptance brought him to the moment years later when he finally said the words he once couldn't: "I wasn't ready for this." It wasn't an admission of weakness. It wasn't a confession of defeat. It was simply honesty, the kind he had avoided for too long. What he revealed next, however, would show just how deeply that pain had shaped everything he'd done since. What Vin eventually realized was that the hardest part of this entire journey wasn't the loss itself. It was trying to live with the silence that came after. There were things he simply couldn't explain to the public, the media, or even his closest friends. Because how do you describe losing someone who felt like a part of your identity? How do you find the right words for a pain that doesn't fit neatly into a headline? He didn't talk about the nights he stayed awake replaying old conversations. He didn't mention how stepping onto a movie set felt completely different without the person who once stood beside him. And he didn't tell anyone how many times he considered walking away from the franchise that built his career, not because he didn't love it, but because continuing without his brother in spirit felt wrong. But the world kept watching. Fans kept expecting. Studios kept planning. And he kept trying to keep up, even though emotionally he was far behind. Friends later said they noticed a shift in him, a quieter tone, a slower smile, a heaviness he tried to hide. Yet Vin never wanted pity, and he never wanted to make his grief a spectacle. So instead of speaking about how lost he felt, he carried it privately, turning it into something between him and the memory of the man he missed every day. And that unspoken struggle didn't just affect his personal life. It changed his creative choices in ways people didn't fully understand. He became more protective, more mindful, more invested in the idea of family, because the word meant something entirely different to him now. It wasn't just a theme, it was a reminder. But the most surprising shift was still coming, something that would redefine how he approached every new movie, every new character, and every moment he stepped in front of a camera. As the films continued, something subtle began to change. Viewers noticed it in little moments: the way Vin delivered certain lines, the way he held certain scenes, the emotion behind words that used to feel like simple dialogue. The franchise wasn't just action anymore. It wasn't just fast cars or big stunts. It had become a tribute, piece by piece, to the person who helped build it from the ground up. Insiders at the time said Vin became much more hands-on with the emotional tone of the movies. He wanted the story to reflect something real, something honest, not a direct recreation of his experience, but a feeling that captured the weight of loyalty, loss, and unbreakable bonds. And anyone who watched closely could see it. That quiet, heartfelt depth in the later films didn't appear by accident. It was shaped by everything Vin was carrying. There were rumors, too, though always framed as speculation, that certain scenes were influenced by memories of conversations they once shared on set. Reports claimed Vin would occasionally walk away from the cameras just to reset, breathe, and gather himself before filming a moment that hit too close. Whether true or not, those whispers only added to the emotional undertone fans sensed throughout the series. And the most iconic tribute of all, the farewell scene that left millions in tears, wasn't just cinematic. It was deeply personal. That wasn't a performance. It wasn't acting. It was Vin stepping into a moment of closure he hadn't been ready to face in real life. When he later said he struggled to film it, no one was surprised, because the role of Dominic Toretto wasn't the only one speaking in that moment. Vin Diesel, the man, was speaking too. But even after that emotional farewell, something inside him still hadn't healed. And that lingering ache eventually led to one of the biggest turning points in his personal life. Healing isn't a straight line, and for Vin, it was anything but predictable. For a while, he thought diving into work would help him move forward. He convinced himself that staying busy, staying productive, staying in motion would keep the pain at bay. But grief doesn't care about schedules or filming dates. It waits. And years later, it resurfaced in a way he didn't expect. It happened during what should have been a normal day. Nothing intense, nothing dramatic. Just a simple moment with his kids. A small reminder of how quickly life moves. They were laughing, talking, living fully in a way only children can. And as he watched them, something inside him shifted. A memory hit him, not a sad one, but one of those early conversations with Paul when they talked about fatherhood and how important it truly was. That memory, gentle as it was, cracked something open. Vin felt this sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion that had bin sitting in the background for years. It wasn't devastation. It wasn't shock. It was a realization, a painful one, that the person who once encouraged him to embrace this chapter of his life wasn't here to see how far he'd come. And that hurt more deeply than almost anything he had faced before. He later admitted in an interview that he had moments where he just stopped, sat quietly, and let the emotions come. Not because he was weak, but because pretending he was fine didn't work anymore. He said it felt like a delayed impact, as if the full weight of the loss didn't hit until years after the world had moved on. And that moment of emotional honesty led him to the understanding he had spent nearly a decade avoiding. The truth he finally voiced publicly. When Vin finally decided to open up, it wasn't planned. He wasn't seated on a talk show or announcing something dramatic. It came during a quieter conversation, when he finally allowed himself to speak from a place he used to avoid. And the words he chose were simple, but they carried a depth that left fans silent. I wasn't ready for this. He wasn't just talking about the loss. He wasn't just talking about that heartbreaking night or the years of grief that followed. He was talking about the responsibility of carrying someone's memory forward, of honoring a bond that shaped his life in ways people still don't fully understand. He was admitting that no amount of fame, strength, or success could prepare him for losing someone who felt like a real brother. But what made that confession so powerful wasn't the pain. It was the acceptance. The idea that healing doesn't mean forgetting. That grief doesn't disappear just because time moves forward. That you can be strong and still hurt, accomplished and still grieving, successful and still missing someone every single day. And when he said those words, it wasn't just closure for him. It became a moment of connection for fans around the world. People who had followed his journey for years finally understood why certain scenes felt heavier, why certain quotes hit deeper, and why he carried himself with a different kind of groundedness. This wasn't a revelation meant to shock anyone. It was simply the truth of a man who had spent years hiding a wound in plain sight. And by finally admitting it, he found something he never expected: peace.